Hey now! NecroVMX here, back with another review of a SNES RPG, and this time, well, I'm doing something a little bit different. You see, when I started this series, I wanted to focus on off-the-beaten-track RPGs. I said to myself, everyone is aware of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Breath of Fire, and Lufia. I wanted to review games that maybe you've never heard of, or maybe you were aware of the game but you never tried it, or you just want to know if it's worth your time. The thing is, you guys seem to really like my reviews and have asked me for more. Recently, while I was playing Breath of Fire on Twitch, I asked if you guys would be interested in me reviewing more well-known games like Breath of Fire or Lufia that I've recently streamed, and adding them to the review list, and the answer was yes. So I'm still going to be doing lots of off-the-beaten-path RPGs, but I'm also going to be doing ones you've definitely heard of and probably played. So today I'm covering Lufia and the Fortress of Doom, which I played on Twitch on Friday afternoons. Those are the streams where I focus on revisiting games that I played ages ago on YouTube. And of course I played it in the Hygan emulator with no modifications. Lufia and the Fortress of Doom was developed by Neverland, who are mostly known, these days at least, for the Rune Factory series, which is a spin-off of the Story of Seasons series, formerly known as Harvest Moon. Not to be confused with the Harvest Moon series, which is a spin-off of the Story of Seasons series. You know, with things like that, almost make me want to bring back Clearing Confusion. Anyway, Neverland made a whole lot of games and eventually went out of business, and most of the key talent moved over to Marvelous. Lufia and the Fortress of Doom was actually their first game, and since the game got 3 sequels and a remake of one of its sequels, it's safe to say that they came out of the gate pretty strong. Lufia is a classic-style turn-based JRPG where you have a nameless main character and 3 companions who rid the world of 4 evil gods in a game very reminiscent of Dragon Quest. I myself had thought at the time, and still to a certain extent think, that Lufia was a good stand-in for Dragon Quest V. Not that it's quite on the same level as Dragon Quest V, it's a completely different sort of game, but rather that Dragon Quest V wasn't released outside of Japan on the Super Famicom at the time, and Lufia was a Dragon Quest-style game, and that goes a long way towards scratching that itch. So, as usual, I will be rating Lufia and the Fortress of Doom on a scale from 1 to 10 in the following categories: graphics and presentation, music and sound effects, story and writing, gameplay and controls, and balance and difficulty. And as usual, I'll remind everyone of the way I utilize the 10-point scale, which I believe is the proper way, with 5 being average, meaning that a score of 5 out of 10 is an average score, not a bad score, and a score of 7 out of 10 is a good score, not an average score. Anyway, let's get into it. For its graphics, talking about Lufia is kind of awkward because there's really nothing wrong with the graphics, other than that they probably just could be better. The game has good sprite work, particularly for enemies and bosses, a fair amount of animation, and most importantly, lots of bright colors and good use of shading. It's an attractive game with a cartoony style that just looks good overall. However, you might assume based on the graphics that this game came out in 1991 or so, when in fact it came out in 1993, the same year as games like Secret of Mana, The Seventh Saga, and Illusion of Gaia, which all had larger, more detailed sprites, more animation, and in the case of Secret of Mana and Illusion of Gaia, even more good use of bright colors. There's nothing wrong with the way it looks, it just came out at a time when other games looked better. Of course, when you think about the game's aesthetic, it borrows heavily from Dragon Quest, and it kind of makes sense. Dragon Quest had always graphically been evolutionary rather than revolutionary, focusing more on maintaining its unique art style than trying to blow you away with lots of detail. Until Dragon Quest VIII, Dragon Quest had always sort of lagged behind the curve in terms of graphic fidelity. Usually the games weren't ugly, but they always looked a bit simplistic. It seems that with Lufia, Neverland was strongly influenced by the decisions of Chunsoft and kept things simple. So yeah, the graphics of Lufia don't blow me away, but they're nice. The game's presentation is fairly typical of early SNES RPGs in the sense that it's kind of all over the place. In-game menus are confusing at times. Items and spells sometimes have 2 numbers next to them. One number might be how many items you have or how much a magic spell costs, with the other being how many times you can use that item or spell. It's easy to get these mixed up. However, everything that doesn't involve the pause menu is pretty great. The game doesn't do battle scenes, instead having an overlay appear over the current scene for battles, and all cutscenes are done right where you are with word bubbles appearing above the characters' heads. It's all very easy to follow and understand, and it's quite charming. In battles, there's a direction-based menu with easy-to-understand icons. It's similar, but not as innovative as Paladin's Quest with the direction-based input. Spell animations are interesting and well-drawn. Overall, the game's look is good. While there'd absolutely be room for improvement, I give some leeway to the fact that they were going for a specific style, and also for the fact that this was Nevermore's first ever game. For graphics and presentation, I give Lufia and the Fortress of Doom a 7 out of 10. For its music, Lufia has a very specific sound that is just easily recognizable. There's a certain approach to instrumentation that is very unique. If you've ever played any of Neverland's other games, then you know what I mean. The songs are very catchy and will stick in your head, especially the town and overworld themes. The town themes, of which there are a few, tend to be light and poppy with good hooks, and the overworld theme sounds almost like an action theme from an arcade title. Also, for a very story-based game, Lufia utilizes a lot of different themes for cutscenes, which have to be lighthearted, or tragic, or tense, or any combination of those, and the themes always fit the exact mood that was needed. The soundtrack is one of the highlights of the SNES library at the time. Comparing it to games that came out in the same year, well, Lufia stands above Illusion of Gaia, the Seventh Saga, and even the great soundtrack of Secret of Mana, so I'd have to say that it likely has the best SNES RPG soundtrack of 1993. The game's sound effects are completely another thing, though still extremely unique. The meaty, bass-filled sound effects of battle bring to mind the Sega Genesis guttural sound chip, which worked wonders for action games. Lufia is of course not an action game, but there's a lot to be said for the meaty, guttural feel of a critical blow, or the terrifying, static-esque feeling of getting toasted by a spell. With the sound effects being reminiscent of a Sega game, I can't help but wonder what the cancelled Genesis port of this game would have sounded like. Another nice touch that I have to mention is the beeping sound that NPCs make when talking, which is just at the right level to not be annoying. But the kick is that different characters beep at different tones, which almost gives them a voice in a sense. I don't know, maybe it's silly, but I'm a fan of when games do things like that. Overall, Lufia is a great game to hear. It's not going to compare to the likes of Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy VI, but for the year in which it came out, it very much did not need to. Remember, when I make comparisons to other games, I'm really only comparing to games that are released in the same year and usually on the same system. So for music and sound effects, I give Lufia and the Fortress of Doom a 10 out of 10. So after I give a perfect 10 for the game's sound, you might sound a little bit surprised when I tell you that the story and writing is actually the best part of Lufia. Yeah, you know that it's going to get another 10, but I'll take some time to explain why. First of all, let's talk about the actual plot. Earlier, I used very reductive language to describe the plot. The nameless hero, 3 companions, taking on 4 evil gods to save the world, blah blah blah. That's not exactly lighting the world on fire. It's not all that different from older RPGs, including the original Final Fantasy. But the actual plot about saving the world from dark gods, who are called Sinistrals, almost takes a back seat to character development. While streaming the game, my chat joked that Lufia is a story about a relationship with a backstory about saving the world, and that is not wrong. The main hero, who I named Nova, since that's the closest thing that he has to a canon name due to it being the name appearing in the game's strategy guide, I'll just call him that from here on out, he meets a mysterious young girl in his youth named Lufia, who seems to appear out of nowhere with no parents or backstory. He winds up growing up with Lufia, and the two grow close, with Lufia having fallen in love with Nova, though Nova seems to be unaware of the extent of her feelings, questioning behavior that to him seems like random erratic mood swings. Lufia essentially forces herself onto the journey, being unable to deal with Nova leaving her for adventure. As the two go through their journey, along with Aguro and Jerem, the 2 other companions, they learn a lot about their relationship and why the world is worth saving, with the Sinistrals arguing that mankind needs to be suppressed and ruled. Lufia is at its heart a tragic love story, with Lufia and Nova wanting very much to protect each other, which ironically means putting themselves in danger. Lufia's slightly childish behavior is actually endearing in a way. They don't try to make her the perfect girl-next-door archetype. She seems like a realistic character with flaws. And that brings me to the writing. Playing it now, the writing in Lufia doesn't seem all that special, but if you take off the nostalgia blinders and you look at the writing and localization of many SNES classics, well, They usually kind of come off as either extremely goofy, like Final Fantasy IV, or a very good story run through a translator and a trash compactor, like Final Fantasy VI. When you consider its contemporaries and what else came out that year and previous, Lufia stands out as one of the first RPGs to have a script that was well written and well translated. The characters feel more real than in most RPGs of the time, and the seriousness of the story, showing the consequences of war and violence and destruction, as well as human suffering, it's all very impressive. Now, that's not to say that Lufia is always depressing. It throws in enough lighthearted humor so that the entire game isn't one big downer, but a warning, this game is tragic at its core. By today's standards, Lufia seems pretty standard, and maybe exactly as epic as you remember Final Fantasy IV being in your head. But if you look at it objectively, Lufia's story and writing are a mile better. If you want to play grand epic tragedies on the SNES, there's probably just exactly 5 games that fit that mold, and 2 of them are Lufia games. That says a lot. If you're wondering, the other 3 would be Final Fantasy VI, Dragon Quest V, and Ogre Battle, though I'll also give an honorable mention to Breath of Fire 2 as well. So yeah, Lufia and the Fortress of Doom gets a 10 out of 10 for the story and writing, and it's well deserved. For gameplay and controls, Lufia is almost painfully standard. Nova moves very slowly on the overworld, but moves faster in towns. Random encounters come fast and often, and dungeon design starts off linear, but it goes into more abstract and open designs later in the game. It plays a lot like Dragon Quest, in other words. That, for me, is not a bad thing, though if you're the type that gets annoyed by a lot of random battle encounters, well, buyer beware. Lufia also uses a few tropes from earlier RPGs that have since fallen by the wayside, such as accidentally targeting a dead enemy and wasting your turn. Since you'll spend a lot of your time in battle, I should mention that Lufia is turn-based, but not in the way that most games were at the time. Usually in a turn-based RPG, you enter commands for all of your party members at once, and then they play out in a single turn mixed in with the enemy's actions, with the order being determined by a speed stat. Each battle in Lufia, well, they start out like that, but there's a slight lag between entering a command and the character executing it, and then after they execute their command, they become available again, meaning that it's almost more similar to active time battle games like Final Fantasy IV through VI. Now, how much lag there is between your command and the action is based on your speed stat, but also on what action you've selected. Spells, for instance, take a bit longer to come out than attacking, and using items is more instant than that even. This takes some getting used to and can lead to some rookie errors early on, but it works pretty well once you get into the groove. My biggest issue with the battle system is that due to the laggy spells, sometimes you target an enemy for a physical strike, and you may end up hitting absolutely nothing due to a spell that you put in previously destroying the enemy that you targeted. You have to keep mindful of what you've already done. Another slight issue is that with groups of enemies, you cannot select which enemy you're targeting for a single strike. This is something that's borrowed from Dragon Quest, but Dragon Quest, I think, did it better. Overall, there's not any deal breakers here. If I had to change one and only one thing in Lufia, I would increase the character's movement speed on the overworld and in dungeons to be the same as in towns. Dungeons can be painfully long due to how slow you move in conjunction with the number of battles, which can be hard in maze-like areas. Sometimes you're just trying to get your bearings, but you're inundated by battles. Now, there are items that you could use to walk around without battles, but of course you won't be gaining experience points if you do that. And you need experience points. There are a lot of fun things about this game, though, that mitigate the slight issues with the gameplay. For one, there's a lot of hidden items that are very fun to find, which gives you incentives to explore every nook and cranny. There's also the Old Cave, a multi-level dungeon that you'll explore slowly throughout the entire game, giving you reason to backtrack in a game that's mostly linear, which is good. There is nothing really wrong with the gameplay in Lufia, it's just trying very hard to be Dragon Quest, while having a much slower pace. Consider how many times that I've played through the game, I obviously don't have major issues with that. For gameplay and controls, I give Lufia and the Fortress of Doom a 7 out of 10. For balance and difficulty, Lufia definitely skews harder than most JRPGs of the time. This is due in part to the frequent battles and long dungeons, which will wear down your resources fast if you're not at the level to breeze through the dungeon, and partly due to the brutal, hard-hitting bosses as well. There is a wake-up boss only a few hours into the game that will likely force you to either stop and grind up a few levels, or, if you're aware that it's coming, to prepare meticulously. Luckily, the game offers a variety of spells and useful items that you could use in battle, with the most useful being the various gourds that raise your stats. Utility spells are also important to utilize, particularly Lufia's Mirror spell, which reverses hostile spells of the caster, at the expense of also reversing friendly spells. You can just mash the attack button for weaker enemies, but as you go through the game you'll be forced more and more to use your brain, which I appreciate. If I had to compare the difficulty of this game to another, I'd say it's similar to Dragon Quest III. It doesn't pull any punches, and it forces you to learn it. Some of the long dungeons towards the end can get very confusing, especially the ones with warps that may even connect to other dungeons. There are occasionally also where do I go next parts of the game, though they're thankfully not all that common, and usually it's just a matter of talking to the right NPC, or remembering something from a previous area and backtracking there. Balance-wise, there's a few difficulty spikes, where either an area is suddenly a lot more dangerous than where you just were, or a boss proves much more than you're able to handle at the time. Lufia is a long playthrough with a slow pace, so there's no shame in grinding or revisiting old areas. Lufia also has an element of high risk, high reward, such as the double-sided nature of the aforementioned Mirror spell, or the level-based Old Cave, where if you do the floor that comes next as soon as it becomes available to you, you'll absolutely be facing off against enemies that are several levels stronger than you, but also getting access to treasure chests with equipment that is not yet available to you, making the Old Cave a place that you could sneak through using enemy warning items to gain high-level equipment earlier, or it's an ideal grinding spot due to enemies that are stronger than you. Lufia is a tough game, but it's never an unfair one, and while it has wake-up bosses, it's mostly done in a way for you to think about different approaches to a battle, rather than just being stronger than the boss, which I think fits the theme of humans taking on Sinistrals rather well. For gameplay and difficulty, I give Lufia and the Fortress of Doom an 8 out of 10. Lufia and the Fortress of Doom was somewhat slept on at the time, with RPG fans flocking to the more popular Secret of Mana, and I think this is a game that it became more well-known afterwards, with its more warmly received sequel. And then, of course, it was compared negatively to its sequel, but looking at it objectively from the standpoint of an RPG released in 1993, I think Lufia blows Secret of Mana out of the water. Sorry, not sorry, but this is a great game, and the overall score of 8.4 reflects that. Though dated in some ways, its dated nature comes off as impressive when you look at what it was up against in terms of storytelling and writing, and with a great soundtrack to boot. You know, I've said a lot about Secret of Mana over the years. Maybe I need to review that one next and finally put all of my cards on the table.